It gave me one at the beginning.
Yeah, it should give you another one. Maybe not. I thought it did.
I don't have another indicator, but on the top left corner of the screen, it says recording.
Okay, got it. Okay. All right, good. So yeah, let's bite in wherever you'd like to. We could bite in based. You've seen a few things, and we could start somewhere you like to start, or I could do a little bit of a quick tour, bearing in mind that you've seen what you've seen.
Okay. I think I would benefit most from a bit of a quick tour, and then we can bite in somewhere that we'll decide from
Yep.
the quick tour where to
right. Good. Okay. Let's see. You'll notice the slides in front of you now on the left, and I've made these, I think, as large as I can make them. Yeah. Well, when you head way up to the top, slides are number 1 here and number 2, and they say podcast test, etc. And I want to start with a slide that I put up there, but I also want to then skip all the rest of these slides and just point out that what we did literally is start all over again from the beginning, which was the plan of attack in the first place. Was let's try it, see how bad it works out. If it's not terribly bad, we'll just start again. We won't have lost very much. We'll have had a dress rehearsal, sort of. So that's more or less what that stuff is, except for this slide. And this is a metaphor which I use a bunch of times, but it was a really good place to start. And I wish I had done it the second time. Maybe I did. Let's see. Let's go back to that slide. Sorry. And make it a little bigger so you can actually read it, except it's not this slide. It's maybe this one. Yeah. All right. This is a plan of attack for this whole project. And there are 2 metaphors here, and it's important to keep them in mind. They're both reasonably good frameworks for the whole project. And the first one is, you can see it, but I'll just run through it, is to set out the rules of the game and then propose a league and then build a team in that league and then run it. Get other teams to join, right? Which one team won't do it, right? You absolutely have got to have a league if you're going to get, say, better at any particular sport, right? You're going to have to define it, invite people into it. You're going to have to put together an example of people doing it well, but that's got to be done in multiple places necessarily in order to generate the craft that comes through interaction with one another, right? Any kind of game like that, rule-governed game that involves diverse aims or diverse participants, something like that. That's the league metaphor. And on the other side, this one's a little bit richer. We're going to build a new town infrastructure. Imagine a town out west of me. You can imagine the railroad days, right? Or something like that, where, and maybe just communication infrastructure and telegraph and maybe some early semblance of electricity, maybe eventually some running water, those sorts of things where somebody sort of builds from the ground up. Well, we're going to build a new town infrastructure, and we're going to point out lots and lots of places for people to build on it. In fact, the point of it is to build the town. Okay? But in order to bring people in there, in fact, everybody who lives in that town is going to live in a building. And so we're going to build a building, and it's going to be a really cool building. And in order to get to people to come and live in that particular building, which is not the whole town and could never be the whole town, but you're going to have to invite people in effectively. And part of that is going to have to compare and contrast with the buildings they're living in now, presumably somewhere else other than this town, right? Migrate here. Okay. Well, that too is a complex multiplayer social initiative that takes a long time to move forward. It sounds like maybe JP just joined us.
Hey, JP.
All right. Hi, there I am.
Good to see you.
Hey, Rachel.
Hey.
Let's see, change the name here. Okay. Hi. Sorry I'm late.
Yeah, no trouble. I'm glad you came at all. Lots going on. So JP, we're just doing a quick run through some of the preliminaries, sort of a speed drive through stuff that we've talked about already.
Oh, sweet.
I started, I don't know if you're on a very small device. In any case, I've got a slide shared here, and it is this ridiculously simple plan of attack.
Oh, cool.
Nice. Slide. It's the team analogy and the town analogy.
Right.
In both cases, you don't have a town without lots of buildings. You don't have a league. I should have said a league analogy and a town analogy, right? Without lots of teams. Now the question is, what are the analogs of the teams and what are the analogs of the buildings? And for that, I'm going to lay out at the same time what the rules of the game is and what the infrastructure of the town is. And you've seen a hint of this language before, and this is the high information flow network of rich communities. So the whole task here, you could say this entire project is to get people to conceive of themselves, ourselves, our collective enterprise as in terms of that model, that high information flow network of rich communities. What I mean by rich communities, we've touched on a little bit. It's having more in common with one another, enough in common with one another that you can kind of parallel process information in a certain way because you have a high level of trust. The way you experience something will have meaning, and you can quickly tell about it to somebody else who can benefit from it because they understand the context, your filter, so to speak.
Totally.
That's a particularly rich community insofar as you build connections of trust like that. That's what I mean by rich communities. Those communities actually can process information faster, so they're information rich because they can process information on a coherent model faster than you can do it yourself, or any individual can do it himself, herself. So rich community, what we do now is we have some measures, right? We do some of that. We have people who think like us in some ways. We go looking for them. We tend to cluster around them. We get tribal, maybe, to use language of the day. We get polarized at our worst. We run into diversity, which we may value, but we generally value it in individuals. We less well value it, I think, when you talk about honor diversity. People don't generally mean honor this great, big, similarly thinking community over here, in part because there aren't very many such communities, I think. But to the extent that they are, right, they look more like, they look less diverse, and they are less diverse insofar as they're a rich community. Internally, they're less diverse. It's the whole that has the diversity. If you've got a number of those, but we really don't have a number of those that grow very rich to the extent that we have them to some extent, and they grow rich in some measures. To that extent, we tend not to be very good at exchanging information from one to the other. You do your thing, you do you, right? And that sort of means that's fine. You go do your thing, but I don't learn from it. That's you, that's not me, right? That's sort of an individualist turn, that you do you moment in our culture. And at worst, we start to hurl insults at one another when we feel threatened by them. All I need to know is, all I needed to know, I just heard this, right? And right away, I understood. This is one of those people. That kind of language we have. That is not exactly high information flow. As a matter of fact, we pretty obviously And I think you don't have to look further than yourself to see the tendency. I don't mean you personally, particularly, but each of us, when we choose sides for a moment, right, with and get into something, and people react to us in some way, maybe with some distrust, we tend to throw that distrust right back at them. It's very difficult not to. Um, and we could find ourselves engaged in ad hominem arguments pretty easily, more easily when tensions are inflamed than when we are deliberately trying to collaborate. And you have to look hard to find the really rich, successful, multi-disciplinary, what's the word? I don't even have a word. Multi-communal is just not a phrase we use, right? We just don't actually have a phrase for this because we don't generally bring communities together where we recognize that community as an entity and bring it systematically in contact with this other one. That's really not so much a thing. But you could imagine such a thing nonetheless, and imagine it. And that's the rules of the game. And that's the infrastructure of the town. What would have to be present in order to build precisely such an environment? This would be a network of rich communities in which information was flowing. It's a really good question how it's flowing, or even what counts as information. These days, the phrase that's all a buzz is fake news, right? At least if we promulgate a point of view with what we think is information, we get turned down, right? That's fake news, challenge to authority, all kinds of, there are all kinds of dynamics surrounding that. So I've been talking long enough. I'm going to let you in. That's something like, if we stopped right now and just went home, I'd say you would have a pretty nice entry understanding of what on earth this project is. Now, how you get there from here, there's a whole lot more to be said. And what's a building look like when it grows up? What's a community look like when it grows up? How do we get them to interact with one another? Are there any standards of truth here? Is there any way we can make progress, or do we just discover plurality? Does red find out there's green, find out there's yellow, right? And thanks very much. But and now maybe it's more beautiful in our diversity, but we're going nowhere on the issues we disagree about. Or is there something different than that, or maybe even better than that, that we could hope to aspire to? All of that is yet to come. I'll stop for now.
Totally. A couple things. First off, please excuse if my eyes go off screen. I'm just like writing down certain like phrases that I want to look into more later. So I promise I'm not texting. I'm just like making notes for myself. But yeah, the first thought that I have there, your kind of closing question is like a big thing that percolates for me because like I mean, it seems like lots of people in particularly recent history are trying to have like difficult conversations or are finding themselves in difficult conversations to varying degrees of success. And for me, I think about what even like when we engage in conversation, what does success look like? And are people looking for the same thing and defining success in the same way? So is success convincing somebody of your viewpoint? Is success being able to engage like for information to understand but not necessarily convince? Is success to like all wind up with the same opinion? Like I don't think too many people would think that like through having difficult conversations, what we're looking for is to have everybody think the same thing all the time. I don't think too many people would take that harsh of an opinion. But in a lot of conversations that we do engage in, we're looking to convince the other person. And that's not necessarily a bad thing because like there are some, in my opinion, there are some perspectives that are either born out of like misinformation or like there's that's too simplistic even, but there's like a history of like usually when people have super strong emotions about something, it's not something that just happened like that because of like one random fake news article or whatever. But it's born out of like a longer history of feeling a certain way and like bringing you towards that point. But yeah, just thinking about the idea of like how we define success in the difficult conversations we engage ourselves in, either with people who we would consider in our network, or people, I think even more people who we would consider out of our network.
Yeah.
That's something that just kind of jumps to mind.
Yeah, that's good. We end up talking, I would say, I think we have a lot to say. Why do now I sound like I'm talking like the Pope, we, papal we, or
We collective.
um, there are a lot of folks who are looking, I'd say, sympathetically toward some reasonably overlapping set of sources. Alistair McIntyre's work is a big part of those. There's a whole Center for Ethics and Culture at the University of Notre Dame that, and I don't mean to suggest univocity or that he's the single leading light there or anything like that. Neither of those things are true. But I do think there's a high concentration of sympathy for McIntyre's work in that crowd. There is, for example, meeting around that crowd is the international, what's it called? International McIntyrean Society or something like that. There is such a thing. And they're all, they're folks who are dedicated to try to get the McIntyre's picture articulated clearly, correctly, and then productively in terms of where do we go from here. And I certainly grew up in that shadow. It's fair to say. So a lot of so there's a lot of McIntyre in this, although there's a lot more than McIntyre in it too. Of course,
Okay.
more than McIntyre and McIntyre, of course, in his own head. I mean, he's doing much more than comes out in the occasional book. So anyway, there's also another dimension as we've been talking, John and I have been talking about this for a while. So that's another dimension of, and there too, JP and Rachel and John, when you ever hear this, or if you ever hear it again, or anybody else who's in the conversation, I don't mean to, I do mean us to go somewhere. That is to say, I invited folks to come together to talk through this project. And not only talk through this project, but this project is actually a very large project. It will turn out, and you'll see more of that. You can already sort of see sounds like a big social project so far. If it turns out that the communities have to grow to encompass everything one could think about or do, right? Then all of a sudden they've grown ambitious, right? And what they tend to hold in common looks more and more like a worldview, and the interaction between them looks more and more like the worldviews at their fullest and highest levels of expression, which sounds like what universities do, right? Except universities tend to think about it, except rather than build on it. But if it's all the things that you do, not just all the things you think that are at issue here, then this is just as much a political movement as it is, and it requires political reform in the same way that it requires whatever we should call what universities do, or what universities would do if they sort of grew up. I don't mean to treat them like children. I mean to view them from this particular perspective. And in this perspective, communities, as they grow and inquiry gets richer and richer and richer, communities grow up and build universities. And if they are they either build a university that just talks to themselves, or it's a university that talks to others. And if it talks to others, it either shoots at them, and overly simplifying, right? I mean, they could look to learn from them, or they could just try to survive and steal their children and protect their own. And there you get apologetics.
Will do.
You get polemics, right? You get all of those various things. And universities could do that. And oftentimes universities have done that kind of thing. And there are small universities around smaller communities now where most people go there tend to hold an awful lot in common. Right. And I mean, I sort of don't want to name them because I don't have time to speak about them with enough nuance. Right. Something like that. So, but you can fill in the blanks yourself, and you can find universities where the people who go there, the people who teach there, the students who go there expect to have a lot in common. And they tend to be smaller, and they do tend to be somewhat more polemical or apologetic or circle the wagons. And there are some notable exceptions. Anyway, so all of that is just a rambling look ahead at what the various dimensions are of a project like this one. So yeah.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to throw one more metaphor at you, and maybe it'd be better if we took questions on the part, or questions, comments, talked about anything you wanted
Totally.
to.
So I'm just trying to like for my own brain, synthesize the information that we have thus far. So if I'm understanding correctly, and I think like you were talking about, this is like a project with an intention. So am I close to say this project aims to using the structure of the like team, a good team would want a league, and similarly like in a town there are a bunch of buildings and people all have their own buildings, but we're building a particular building, and part of this project is trying to like convince people, not by like selling or anything, but just convince people that this particular building is something that they would want to be a part of. And by building I mean community. So if I'm understanding correctly, this project aims to convince individuals that rich communities where there is a plurality of opinion are something, it is something positive to be a part of. So that would be step one. And through convincing individuals that this is important, there would then be groups that practice this. And in there being groups that practice this, groups do not exist just in a vacuum. There are groups that might not practice it, but the idea would be that it would be an example of a positively functioning, I'm going to use organism, but a positively functioning organism, and seeing that positivity radiated from this particular building might call others in to act in a similar way. It's a very like vague, oversimplified, but is that basically what?
That's helpful, and I think all of it on target. It's a little hard to tell because it was so rich that all those various things need to be unpacked a little bit, which is, that's where we are at the beginning of. So at this level of generality, we shouldn't expect too much precision, right? we're dealing with analogy in large measure.
I'm just I'm not trying to be precise right now, and my word choice is definitely not precise. But what I am trying to do is just pin down like the intention of like what I can expect in watching things back, and also going forward. What I can expect is trying to like, if everything went the way that, if everything went perfectly, this is like what you would want to have shake out at the bottom.
Yeah. I think that's right. You could say, let's see, you could say, if we had it to accomplish this project with, we would pull it off the shelf, the magic pixie dust, right? And you just toss it down on some substrate, you toss it down somewhere, and up sprouts a wonderfully functioning league, and or upsprouts this wonderfully functioning town, right? Both of those things. Now, I take that very strange analogy because I want to slightly better specify it and say that we actually need something like it. So I'm going to switch to a scientific metaphor, and that is one of a self-assembling monolayer. That's an important thing. Literally, in a self-assembling monolayer, there is a pixie dust. It might be, and I'm going to give us they are legion. There are many, many strategies that do this sort of thing. The reason you need to do it is any circumstance in which, if you want, say, at the nanotechnology scale, if you want to move a whole bunch of stuff together in a very complex pattern, you can get part by part, but it's intensely laborious to do so. And there's billions of them, right? And so you won't get anywhere. What you have to do is parallel process that whole problem. So you have to throw down something which induces the whole thing to make the change all at once. And one of the strategies, and there are legion, but one super cool strategy that I ran across about 20 years ago in a field called molecular nanoelectronics is that of using DNA or other things. For now, let's make it simple, DNA. There's other kinds of molecules that are akin to them. But you could imagine dialing up DNA where literally you have the DNA is a whole string of A's, C's, G's, and T's hooked together in a, with a backbone, right? In the famous double helix configuration in some states of affairs, and those things twist together, and there's layers of twisting, and out comes, modern genetics. But that basic code, I don't know whether you guys knew this. I was blown away when I found out you can just dial it up. You can order up the DNA you want. It's absolutely standard technique. They'll make it for you in the lab. You just say, I would like, and you give them the string, and it's 4,000, it's 10,000 characters long. And here I'm speaking out of turn because I don't actually know the limit in number of characters, but it is thousands. I do know I do know the basic principle of genetics, which is every three of these things codes for an amino acid, right, from which proteins are constructed. And I know the number of things in proteins. And I know a gene is basically that thing that codes for the production of a single protein. So if a protein has got thousands of amino acids interacting in it, then the gene for it has got several thousand. And so I'm not wrong when I'm trying to just order up a gene at the, say, 10 to the 4 scale, at the 10,000 scale. That's about right. And they can build those for you. You can order them up. Now, when you do order them up, you can order them up in such a way that, imagine you wanted a little replica of the state of Rhode Island. I'm going to make this up entirely. And why I picked on Rhode Island or states, I don't know. But it's something you might want, say, the highway maps of the state of Rhode Island, the major streets, etc. And you could code that in DNA. Now, how could you do that? Right? Well, you would see it sort of on the analog in a certain way. I mean, we do it now. We code things up in order to get proteins of certain shapes. That's the basis of drug design, right? I mean, we build those proteins, we stick them in tiny little bacteria, and we grow the proteins that we want in a big tank. The little bacteria grow them for us. This is Eli Lilly's, was among the first, I think, to do this on a production scale, and we build insulin that way. Right? So an insulin is honestly, it's not the biggest of proteins, but it's a little complex. Okay. It's got 4 parts. It's got quaternary structure. Insulin does. So So literally, you can, if we can do that with DNA to get protein shapes and structures, what other structures could we make? Why not the shape? Why not the map of Rhode Island on a surface? Well, I don't know anyone who's done state maps yet, but there's almost no question. In fact, I expect it could be done already, although I could be wrong. But it's one of these things where if you get the technologies and they're rich enough and fruitful enough, you're probably not the first one to think of something that you could do with those technologies. It's general. This is the internet's like that, right? It's like a genie. You rub it if you want it. It probably already exists and it's free if you've already thought about it, right? Because you're never the first one to think about it unless you're way on the cutting edge of something, right? And
Yeah,
exercising a lot of creativity.
Yeah, you could search any random 2 words on Google and someone will have brought them together and something will exist already.
Sure. So it's probably the case that you can do this. And I know that people do it. They design circuits. Literally, a circuit has a genome. And you lay down the DNA in the shape of an AND or an OR gate, right? Or and John, you know these things probably better than I do, right? The various things that engineers put together. We ran across them once in a class somewhere. But the logic of circuit design, all of that can be programmed with molecules. The molecules are the devices. And how do you get the molecules? How do you get a lot of molecules? They're very small. How do you get them exactly where you want them so they interact with one another at exactly the tiny little scales that they interact? Forceps will not do. Right? As a matter of fact, in general, you can't place them from the top down. You have to place them from the bottom up. Now, I'm dwelling on this idea for a reason. I'm trying to get our minds in the idea of a different mode of manufacture, a different mode of change. It's not a top-down mode. It's a bottom-up grassroots mode in which you drop a certain kind of formula in. You get the formula right, and all of this stuff will assemble itself according to that recipe if the recipe is structured right. Well, this is what we would need.
Sorry, would you repeat that one more time? I'm just mulling that and I think I was getting it. I just would like to hear it once more.
Sure. I'm saying it's a different mode of change that is involved in this case, certainly with molecules. If you want to put them together in a highly precise manner at a huge sort of scale, you can't get at it from the top down, not very easily, not at scale. To get it at scale, you got to get it from the bottom up. So you've got to create a little pattern, and that's what you can do with DNA. And then you do it with PCR, right? With PCR basically copies DNA at an incredible rate, right? So that you get many, many billions of copies of this thing. And then you replicate it, and it's a little recipe. You replicate it in that way, and you throw it out. And literally the molecules line up by themselves, and the circuits form for you, just like the pixie dust I imagine pulling off and throwing it down, and up pops a town or up pops a league. We need something like that to induce social change at scale, to get people to all over the place, actually to get billions of them, literally billions of people, not all at once, but in an effective global order. And I'm not trying to be, this is not a new world order. I know exactly what it should look like, et cetera. Although I do think there's some implications as to what it should look like from the basic principles that are involved here. I do think it's a place in which people live in a high information flow network of rich communities. I think that characterizes that order, and that I think that that's exactly right. And so it does have some implications, but it doesn't It doesn't prescribe. You might get all kinds of different views growing up in these different communities about what the whole ought to look like, but they perhaps have some things in common insofar as they've lived in one of these networks, insofar as they understand the mechanisms of living together well and gathering information together well. They live in certain kinds of communities. These are presumably these days self-selected communities, informed informed choices at the entry point, although no doubt people grow up in them too, because people have children and children never make informed choices at first, right? Not possible. Anyway, all of that, there may be lots of views, right, as to how this whole thing ought to play itself out. So I'm not trying to smuggle in a view here, but I do think that if you don't get some kind of way of working out our differences on a paradigm which we do not now seem to have, right? We have our international order is not at all an international order where people are coming to the table, deeply listening to one another and valuing the good of the whole the way any team has to value the good of the league, or any business in a small town has got to value the good of the whole. I don't mean there's no competition inside those spaces, but I do mean there's more than competition. If there's only competition, that thing falls apart. So there's a chamber of commerce in every single town, right? And there's a board that governs every single league, and there are coaches on it, and there are directors of athletics on it, right? And they're interested in higher quality play, not less high quality play, right? You play worthless teams and you don't get better, and everyone knows that in those games. You might think that's true in a conversation about the world. You don't actually learn, you don't actually see yourself from a rich alternative perspective, right? Unless there is that rich alternative perspective, and it has to have grown up somewhere. And apparently it has to grow up not necessarily listening to you at every moment, right? Because it's different enough than you are. So in other words, there's a kind of diversity of perspective that seems to have a kind of value. And if you think all of that, then you're going to have to build something like a global high information flow network of rich communities. And how on earth are you ever going to get there? And I'm saying we need pixie dust. Not literally pixie dust, but we need to think about how do you craft a strategy and spread that strategy where that strategy has a lot of appeal for a lot of people all over the place. Not necessarily all at once at every single moment. Every reaction's got a time scale, even the quick ones, like my little pixie dust cases, or self-assembling in a monolayer. There's time required, and it's not perfect. There's errors involved in the replication, et cetera. And all that thing is a very limited analogy. I'm not trying to say we're trying to do exactly that on a global scale. I'm trying to say we need to do something like that on a global scale. Hence that analogy. So that's also where we're going. And that's also why we need to be online, but not necessarily. It's a good question. We could be making a mistake being online, but we couldn't be making a mistake. Put it this way, the biggest mistake would be to not pay attention to the issues, not pay attention to the resources, because that's exactly how you get a lot of people, right? That is in fact what's moving and shaking the world now and shaping it. Information is flowing in a vast network, but it isn't a network of rich communities. In fact, there's nothing like that even envisioned. Maybe I'm wrong, and I'd love for you to challenge it, because anything you say is never exactly right? There's limited cases, and it could be badly wrong. It's always somewhat wrong. So maybe there's more, and we should not overlook, lest we overlook resources, or maybe even enough that's wrong to say, you know what, I need to change our view here. Something in the strategy does not hold water. Okay. So I've been working on this project for a long time. I'll share with you some resources. I used to jokingly say about this project that I'm going to tell you everything that's true and I'm going to prove it to you. That's the limits of the project. And that is a useful joke, because as a matter of fact, that's what universities are supposed to do. Particularly, universities sit at the nodes insofar as universities bring together rich communities, foster rich communities, bring them together like the CEOs of a league, right? And actually get rich and meaningful exchange from diverse perspectives, which have got to grow, not on an individual basis, but in richer communal forms. I'm not saying there's exactly one communal form that has to be replicated everywhere. That's ridiculous, right? And so I don't know how rich communities need to get to grow to maturity. Good question, but we should canvass all of that. But somehow the parallel processing, the creation of filters which enable parallel processing and exchange across those filters, so that you richly understand things from a radically different point of view, so you can see yourself imaginatively from someone else's point of view, and you can listen to them and you can get it right according to them, that this is how they see the world, and this frankly is how they see you. And you can get that right according to them, right? All of that, we do precious little of that now. But that is precisely what has to happen. That's what information flow across different communities looks like. John knows that we go further down this road toward what truth is. What is it to be right about the perspective? What is progress here? And we'll do more of that, not this moment. But all of that comes down the road also.
Here's a question that I just thought of.
Sure.
So with the goal of this project, with the goal of this podcast, are we trying to make the pixie dust for the monolayer, or are we trying to make a building in the town?
That's good. Yes. Trying to give a smart ass answer to a really good question. I think the answer is yes to both of those. So I think it's the case. Let me imagine an engineering design where in the design there is a particularly rich component that is built out of real pieces, but real pieces which are identified as abstract pieces, where you can swap particulars out for other particulars. You can change, including the particular order in which those particulars hang together with a related order, but it comes together and has some common structure and some common function that you can show in an example, but abstract from at the same time. That's what I think that building is in the design. So that building, you do have to show, people have got to get inside one way of looking at the world, one coherent way of looking at the world, and imagine, what's the phrase I use? I like it. Well, the phrase will come back to me, but there's a note of optimism phrase here. You've got to be able to actionable hope. That's the phrase. You've got to instill actionable hope somehow that there is something larger, more coherent, bought into as a plan of action by a large number of people that makes progress, impressive progress, on its own terms. And that is useful for instilling actionable hope. And that's the pixie dust element of it, right? In other words, you've got to get people in fast enough so that you don't lose them, so that and you're not going to get everybody, right? It's going to take time. I'm not saying that this pixie dust is going to jump to a seed analogy. I'm not going to say all soil is equally fertile here, but a seed, of course, is very much like pixie dust, right? You just gather, you throw it out, and wheat grows, right? And kind of magic. Magic that's explained because of the formula in that wheat, right? The DNA there. So, but it doesn't follow that it's going to grow everywhere. There are conditions for it. What we need to find is a craft. We need to find soil conditions, and we need to find seeds. Now, I get that this sounds intensely theoretic and impracticable, right? I mean, you could have wandered in this conversation anytime, and you could have said, yeah, no kidding. In other words, to change the world, you have to do everything, and apparently that's hard, and you have to have a plan. And right, that plan, if you put it into practice, it would have to operate reasonably quickly in a reasonable period of time. When could this ever not have been what you needed to do, right? And when could it ever not have been described, right? Almost at the level we're describing now. Well, there's some truth to that, but not that much. There are things you can do now that you could never do before. I mean, the internet is such a thing, right? You would need a global system of moving a message and developing an effective rhetoric at scale. Here, the analog is something like fertilizer to address certain soil conditions, which we do in farming in order to get seed to grow there, right? That's sort of the analog of rhetoric, right? You've got to be able to pitch it in such a way that this particular audience finds something attractive about it, right? And learns something from it, brings their own things to the table, and makes something good happen. So it is possible to do that at scale. That's never been possible before. And I'll stop there. There's many other things we could go on to say. I mean, and we've said some of them before, but I do think it's possible. And I also think it's absolutely necessary. In this information age, what you can see now is that we can cluster really very fast around all kinds of stories about practically everything, right? And information flows absolutely at a scorching pace, outstrips our ability to get on top of it, and we're desperately grasping for some way to make sense of it all and deal with the radically different in-your-face challenges to the very veracity of everything that you think you know, right? That's the world we live in now, and we didn't used to live in that world. So the solution is bringing with it problems, and it's also bringing with it some solution. And it's no longer impossible to think about information going out. We do it with songs all the time, right? We can get 1 billion people dancing to a song in a week. I might be exaggerating, but I don't think so, right? I don't think so.
Not with the power of TikTok. No, they.
Yep. Exactly. So there are new possibilities. Anyway, I think I answered, or at least I addressed, JP, the really good question you asked, and it's a tough one, but I think you need to do this whole thing. In the end, if we don't have the pixie dust, it doesn't happen. In the end, you need the whole league. You need the whole town. You can't start small here. I don't mean, that's probably false. You can start small, But if you start small and couple that with start slow, you're wasting your time. Not from every point of view, from the point of view of getting people to live together well in this world, right? You're just not going to have any impact on it. Other people are going to have an impact on it. They're already having an impact on it. They're building trillion-dollar companies, right? That give them this intense power over the information that's shared. They're using all the power of data analysis and machine learning, which is a whole brand new thing, right? Another that's as big, it's arguably as big as the internet. In some ways, it is the internet. Depends on what you mean by it. I mean, it powers the internet. That's what I mean. It's in the DNA of the internet. It's in the algorithm. It's in the search algorithm, for example, right? That everybody uses. So all of that is, if you do something small, it's those things that are happening big they're going to move and continue to grow unimpeded. And that at the moment is a big problem. I mean, I think everybody knows this is a big problem. Everybody's talking about this problem. What we need to do is figure out a solution to it. And the solution involves pixie dust. You've got to have a slick movement somehow. It's got to be a movement. All I mean by slick's a bad way to put it, but it has got to have some things in common with things that are slick. Right? In other words, people got to buy into it. They got to say, they got to look at it and say, damn, right? I'm in. What do I do? Right? And the things that they do have got to actually affect change and accelerating change and coherent change. That's a lot to ask for, but that's exactly what happens when you drop DNA down the circuit, the genome for the circuit. Right? It accelerates change. It makes all the right changes all over the place, all at the same time. So you can't say that kind of change isn't possible. And then you look at Arab Spring or the fall of the Berlin Wall, and you can't say that that kind of change, something analogous to that kind of change, doesn't happen in our social life. It does happen in our social life. And I'm not saying that that very pace of change, I'm not holding that up as the model to shoot for, not at all. But I am saying that that's not the point of it. The point is affecting social change at a very large scale, very fast, is sort of the name of the game these days. I forget the guy's name, the TikTok hero from Sweden. What's his name? For a long time, I didn't even know who he was. And he had 25 million followers or something like that. No, he had 100 million followers, and I didn't even know who he was. Do you know who I mean? The guy from Sweden. What's his name? You've heard of him.
PewDiePie?
Yeah, exactly. PewDiePie. Yeah.
YouTube.
I think, yeah, he's a YouTube streamer.
Well, he is now. Yeah, that's right. He's also in TikTok world. Somehow, wait a minute. No, there was a sort of a war between the TikTok world and PewDiePie, right? What was that whole thing about?
It was T-Series is a big production company, I think based out of China. Don't quote me on that. I think they are though. It's just this big like machine, and PewDiePie is this like homegrown kid. Not a kid, but that was the big controversy.
Right. So I actually heard him in the podcast that John put us onto called Rabbit Hole. Have you seen that? It's a New York Times production.
I actually have not.
Rabbit Hole, highly recommend it. It's 6 or 8 episodes long, each of them about an hour. And it is very, very rich. And it takes you through, actually, it's a very nice primer on the information age. And my point here is stuff happens at that sort of speed, and it happens so fast. I actually follow a lot of this stuff almost for a living, but I'm just not 13 years old. You know what I mean? I'm just not a TikTok addict. I'm just, and it's not something that TikTok in particular, I just let go. I mean, normally I follow things. I just let that whole thing go. I heard about it. No, I'm not that interested. I should have been interested. I think so. Because you have to know what the forces that are changing the world. If you don't know them, you can't shape them. And if, or even react to them. You have to duck when the boom gets lowered, right? When the big crane gets swung, you've got to duck when the wind shifts and the boom shifts, right? The sailing analogy this time, right? You've got to be able to duck. So, okay. So Rachel, this is a lot. We haven't done maybe so much of this all in one condensed space. What I'm trying to, what I'm learning in this, I had a nice conversation with my daughter who was heard much of this from me for a lot of years and knows a lot of it. She reminded me how completely, well, JP, you asked a great question a little while ago about, now, wait a minute, are we after pixie dust or are we after a building in a town? Those don't look anything like one another, right? And it requires an explanation, right? I did my best to give one, but it is not that easy to give an explanation here. What we're looking for is a recipe for massive social change in this very age in a way which equips us to deal with all of the forces of big commerce and machine learning, artificial intelligence as it now exists. All of that is influence is pouring over this space. We've got to figure out, humankind has got to figure out, what are these currents? How do you navigate them? And how do you move somehow to a place where, insofar as you think you know what some of the common elements of a good place to be are, and I'm suggesting those common elements are built into this high information flow network of rich communities. It's good to have people that see things like you, that you can share with quickly, that you can enjoy lots of life with because they're like you. Friends tend to be like you, not radically different than you. You can be friendly towards someone who's radically different than you, but you just don't understand them well enough yet, right? So we've got to gain some understanding, and there's some real merit, and the parallel processing, the efficiency in parallel processing is part of that merit, I think. And we've got to, I think one could challenge this. One could think, no, we've got to hook individuals up in this high information flow network. That I get, but I'm not interested in this parallel processing. That's a trap. Somebody might think so. The challenge is all the mechanisms of non-cognitive formation are now out your window. At least I think they're out the window when you throw them out. They're all parallel processing mechanisms. So Rachel, what do I mean? I mean, you had books in your house when you were young, and you could read any of them, or you could nag your parents into reading them for you. And that whole little life that you lived, this little library life in your home, just one little facet of your home, you didn't pick any of that. Your parents' experience with those books picked them, and there might have been books they'd read that are decidedly not on that list. They were not in your world because they got read to your parents when they were a kid and scared the life out of them. Let's imagine such a book, right? Or imagine just a twisted. I spent a lot of time and too much time railing against, for example, the cartoon show Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. And my kids got to see it, but I railed against it because I thought the moral lessons in that show are corrosive. The But I'll admit to being a strange cat in this regard. But suppose a parent had such a view, okay? Sometime over several beers, we'll have a conversation and we'll go off on Rudolph and see if I can make it anyway. But anyway, the point is, negative experiences also get passed on to you And now your choices are shaped by experience with things that you never even saw. And it doesn't follow that none of that is, it might be the case, right? You might very well, in the story I just told, imagine somebody who had 3 years or 5 years of counseling and trauma because of the Rudolph that they read when they were a kid, to make a really ridiculous case, right? The point is that it might actually be bad for you too, right? Insofar as you're like your parents and it was bad for them and they spared you that, and they simply spared it for you, and they didn't take any of your cognitive processing time. You were nonetheless in contact. Your choices were shaped by information about your options that you never got. You didn't get that information, but it shaped your choices anyway. And maybe for the better, if you climbed back into it selectively, you might say, yeah, that probably was. I appreciate you, mom and dad, right, for doing your best. And you didn't do a terrible job, right? There's a lot of creativity, but there were some things which weren't in our life. That none of the books we read were racist. We didn't even know what racism was, right? Let's suppose, but that was not tolerated in our home, and it wasn't promulgated in our home. And you spared us that. You could imagine a kid from a certain upbringing saying that to their parents at a certain point in social change. That's what I mean by a non-cognitive mechanism for putting your choices are now made in light of a richer set of information about your options than you yourself have processed. And that you don't get in 1,000 points of individual diversity, because you don't have any common structure that you're building on. You don't have an analysis of what that other person needs. You don't have a way of, and here we do it in science all the time. We assume that we're like one another, and the experiments when I conducted, you would conduct it too. You don't have to conduct it all. You would find what I found if you conducted it in the same way. All the very basis of patents and journal articles and everything else is based upon that. What a reasonable practitioner would be able to replicate that idea. So we have enough in common to generate little pockets of agreement, and boy, do those things run. And they go somewhere, and they go through non-cognitive formation. You don't repeat all the historical experiments. You just grab the wire off the shelf. You don't know what it's made of. You don't know why it's coated with that rubber. Not yet. Someday you might if you go down that road, but you can just grab it. So in technology is stored information about your options. And it's non-cognitive formation. And that all comes from clustering and like-mindedness. So you can't simply say we're all individuals. I don't need anybody else. I'm just going to experience stuff all myself. You can, but you'd be in the Stone Age.
Yeah, I mean, it makes me think of like we use experts as bodies of knowledge. So like, for instance, you were talking about like, I know that I can pick up this wire to do this thing. But that makes me think of how like we use experts as shorthands for like, I am not a nuclear physicist, but I have experts that I can look at that I try to follow their best practices. But and I'm just trying to synthesize what you were saying for my own help, for my own understanding. But obviously biases can come in. So like a common theme that I hear people saying a lot is like, do your own research, and like that is very important. But also like, in doing my own research, like if I had to go get a PhD in everything in order to be able to do my own research, that just like is not a practical thing.
Right. So we have shortcuts in research. We have what the literature basically agrees, right? There's certain, in some areas we call them best practices, or generally accepted practices. You don't have to do your own you don't do your own, you don't make up your own methods in accounting. There are generally accepted practices and you follow them, because if you don't follow them, you'll get lost. I just got lost the other day, which is on my mind. I just created, I did not realize the logical mistake I was making in treating a different type of transaction the way I treated it. I treated it in two different ways. And I didn't know there, I had no general accepted practice, right? No reference. And I just made an easy mistake. And if I'd followed, if I'd known the practices, I wouldn't have made that mistake. That's those sorts of things, right? Do your research, find out what the practices are, the generally accepted practices are, find out what bodies over what time have shaped these practices, and assume that no, you don't have a better idea. It's right off the bat, right? You might be able to get one, but it would take you a great deal of time and effort to come up with a better idea than that. So don't take their idea. It's probably pretty good. So that's how we sort of cognitively deal with the non-cognitive formation that we are received and in some ways willingly receive. Right? We take their word for it under certain sets of circumstances. We could be wrong. We can't prove that we're not.
So like, yeah, like every person in a lab coat is not equally a doctor in mind, but like you as a person have the ability to like figure out, okay, I understand like this school has like, this is a medical school where people who graduate are generally pretty qualified. You also have like a basic understanding of like context of like, okay, so this is what a medical degree certifies that you know. People with medical degrees, I'm willing to trust. People without them, I'm not so much. But the thing that I was thinking about, and it's going to take me a minute to come out this question. It's just kind of formulating in my brain as I'm thinking about it. But the thing that I was thinking about is if we are trying to create rich communities that can parallel process with one another, that certain amount of context of understanding how a person sorts through problems seems like something that is really important to have. So I'm wondering if how that fits in with the idea of like people's biases coming in through their like what we consider the context. I'm trying to word this the correct way. I'm wondering how people's individual biases might interact with the pursuit of trying to have a common context through which to understand each other. Because I think in like even my daily life, when I have a particularly hard time trying to understand where someone is coming from is when we don't have like we're not seeing the world the same way. We disagree on fundamental. I always use it. The way I describe it is like we have different glasses through which we're seeing the world. There are different like fundamental truths that we use as the filter through which all information goes through. So I like even to the point where people see credentials as different. And this has become a long convoluted question. But that's just kind of what it made me think of.
Right. I mean, you were exploring some different facets of personal biases in communal rational inquiry, something like that. You're trying to make progress together, right? You're trying to put some things in common and work together. How do you do that with what role do all the individual biases play?
And it seems like the pixie dust would be aiming to try and regulate that so that that is less of a problem, so that when there are grassroots people or grassroots groups trying to kind of aim at this problem, that would be sorted out theoretically at the top so that that's less of a problem than it would be if you just jumped in tomorrow.
Yeah. So you asked a really good question. Let me just say one thing about it. I don't want to go on too long tonight. We'll end at 90 minutes. But I I'm hoping 2 minutes to answer that question. Imagine biases are distributed in a standard distribution, a bell curve, okay? Something like that. This is way one-dimensional, right? So we could make it more dimensions. You could have a bell curve literally, now it's a bump, right? In 2 dimensions, you can imagine, right? A 2-dimensional bell curve, right? And
A surface.
a what?
Surface in 2 dimensions or in three dimensions.
Yeah, it's that's right. You could do it in 3, but the point is the mathematics doesn't care how many dimensions you put in, right? The mathematics can handle more and more dimensions. Just think of um, a, a quadratic equation, a polynomial. You can add more terms, and the math keeps going, right? You can make it more and more complex. You just can't visualize it anymore. The same thing is true here. So let me just stay on 1 dimension. Okay, so I've just got a bell curve, and you've got more and less around some median. And these are biases, these are tendencies in some way. How much of this do you like? Not very much, thank you, know a great deal, right? And you fall in here somewhere, and you're an individual person. We could do calculus on this thing, right? We could basically integrate integrate by little tiny parts, right? And we could imagine drawing little strips, 5 on each side, a total of 10 strips, and those 10 strips have got height, right? And they've got, now what we have are 10 kinds of people, right? Another way to put this is we've just built a histogram, and we just took bin size such that there's 10 bins, right? And we put all the people in there, and that's now what our distribution looks like. Well, now you just need 10 strategies. How do you deal as you move forward when there are types like that? Wouldn't it be nice if there were only 10 types of people and maybe there were only 5 types of differences, right? And now you got 50 different mixings and matchings, right, that have to go on. And you just have to take into account the type of person that you're dealing with, right? Now, we actually do this a lot, right? When you think about it, when we interact with people, we say, that person actually likes it. They don't like a long conversation. Give it to them in 3 words, or they will check out, right? There are such people. Other people, would you please tell me that one more time? And now can I repeat it, right? And and then say it again. There are people who love long explanations from many points of view. Others, and that's one example. And we know this when we interact with people, and we pretty quickly type people. I don't mean, hopefully we don't too much stereotype them. And in fact, there's not 1 dimension, and there's not 5. There's many, many more dimensions. But people with emotional intelligence, generally social ability, and part of that is emotional intelligence, generally learn to pick up what people are like, and we kind of instinctively work around them. But I think that helps. So when your parents are picking books for you, they may have an analysis of you, and they put you in one of these 10 types, right? To take account for what type of person you are. And parents do this all the freaking time, right? Oh, don't read that book to her. She will be have nightmares for weeks, right? She'll be in therapy about it when she's 22. You can't figure that looking forward, but you can sure see it looking backwards. You just take the person who's in therapy about it when she's still at 22, right? And she can tell you exactly why. She never liked that person. She's got trauma about that person because that person told stories of a certain type, etc. Every one of these things, I'm pulling out a real case in my mind, and I'm leaving names out, right? This happens a lot to people. So to the extent that you remember people like that, and you learn people like that, and you recognize that your own kid actually, she does not want a dangerous game, right? Or he doesn't want a dangerous game. He wants a safer game. He wants to sit, he wants to size things up. Please don't throw that child in the air. You'll petrify that child if you throw him in the air when he's 3 years old. You know what I mean? You sort of know this sort of stuff, and you learn it really fast as parents because because you love them and they instantly squawk when you get it wrong. And you see other parents getting it terribly wrong all the time. And you learn really fast about the types of people that there are when you have little ones that you're responsible for. So that is part of how we deal with biases. But all that is a particular model. So in other words, inside our own rich community, where we have a certain account of how people ought to grow up, what are their main challenges, what are their main opportunities, what are the means for overcoming certain difficulties and achieving certain results, etc. Our take on all of that inside a more or less like-minded community is still going to recognize these different types, but it's going to be shaped by the worldview which they're assuming is the same world for their kids as it is for me. Something like that. They have some view of the world, and they raise their kids to make a lot of money, which is what you have to do. Or they raise their kids to be really understanding, which is the most important thing in life. Or they have raised their kids to have a keen sense of justice and oppression, right? And to never put up with it and not sit still for it for a minute. You know what I mean? I've just tried to grab different value sets, right? That might be, and you could imagine people congealing around those value sets, or maybe even people who congeal around those value sets. And you can imagine building pretty different ways of raising kids. But all of those they'd all have to do this little calculus. They'd all have to bin their children. Over, you know what I mean? They wouldn't have infinitely many categories for them, but they'd have a few. They'd have a little bit of a sense for the range of differences. And I think biases are like that too. At some point, you learn that about yourself. But the accusation of bias is tradition bound, right? You see the world the way you see it, and you see this thing that keeps getting in your way, and finally the lights turn on, but the lights turn on from people with certain color glasses on, certain sets of experiences, certain senses of fairness, and this is the way you're not quite fair, and you come to see that. But that's based upon a certain set of common experiences about what constitutes fairness. And there are other communities that will have a radically different account of fairness than you do. We could give examples, but we're 3 minutes away from our 90 minutes. So that's some of what to say about biases. I think you're really onto something. You're going to have to deal to do non-cognitive formation. How the heck do you know what's good for your kids? How do you know what your kid would choose? You have to have an account of your child. What would she like it to have been the case when she grows up if you did for and with her now? That's, I'd say, a rich, sensitive parenting question. And you're guessing your own futures all the time. You don't want to do things you will regret, which is second guessing, right? Which is wishing you had it back and could make a different choice. How do you know, right? How do you know you're not going to second guess your choices? Well, you do your best, right? And you're trying to do that very same thing for your kids. How do you know your kids will not second guess your choices? How do you know they're thinking that you're going to benefit them in any way in what you do? If you're deliberately shaping the environment that people grow in and choosing the stories you tell about what's worth doing and when and why. It's complicated business, and we don't really have a craft for all of this, but we would if we were living in a high information flow network of rich communities in which getting to maturity in a rich community were a thing and people studied it the way they study how to break out of the box on a corner kick in order to get your national coach's license. And they, a case I actually know and learned a lot from, and they've got 5 different drills to get you with a very set of skills that you need to actually acquire to become second nature if you're going to handle corner kicks well defensively. And they've got a whole story about it because they make a science out of how to become a good soccer player. Being in that league and advancing that craft is a thing. And people are all about it. And they grow in craft and they become sort of magicians practically. The things they can teach people to do. And I've seen this myself, things I know, gosh, you've got to learn that, but I don't know where you teach that. Oh, I do. And out comes the magic drill, right? And it works.
Sorry, my computer is going to die, so I just switched devices. Let me just leave right here.
Nice. Well, anyway, we're done. We need a craft of these things, and we don't have one, but we need to change it. So, Rachel, thanks for spending some of your Friday evening with us. JP, you too. I wish I could invite you over, Rachel, to John's house. That's actually where I'm going next.
Sorry, say that one more time. You're just a little quiet.
I wish I could invite you over to John's house. This is where I'm going next.
Yeah, it's a little hard to be in Connecticut, but definitely this was helpful. I definitely need to do a little bit more mulling just to kind of think this through myself. The way I process usually is like in a group, I have half-baked thoughts and then on paper later as well, where I'll be able to do the bulk of my processing. But this was helpful to start at the beginning. And I think I'm going to do, like, once I have the slides, if you could send those my way at your earliest convenience, that'd be fabulous. And I'll go through and kind of prioritize listening to certain episodes, because this is something I'm definitely interested in continuing to be a part of, but I definitely have some catch up to do.
Great. Boy, it's good to have you with us.
Definitely.
I will send you some things, and then we'll take another time sometime and go through some of the things that I send you. The slides are one, but there's a kind of a forest of resources that I also want to introduce you to another time.
Awesome.
Okay. Thanks. Have a great weekend. Say hey to anyone you see in Connecticut that I know and love.
Will do. Yeah, my dad popped his head in. And I think I was on mute though, so you might not have heard it. But yeah, I'll let him know you said hello.
Good. Thanks.
See you, Rachel.
All right. Good to see you both.
Thanks, you too. JP, see you shortly.